The night Boston froze over Elena Jameson stood beneath a flickering street lamp, wrapped in a threadbare cardigan and a lavender dress meant for warmer weather. Her legs had turned to stone, her breath came out in shallow clouds, and her phone screen was black dead and useless. The last bus had long passed, the streets had emptied, and the temperature kept falling. But she stayed on a bench that felt colder than concrete, not because she had nowhere to go, but because she didn't have the strength to try again. At 26, Elena had already mastered the art of survival. She juggled college classes by day and tutoring shifts by night, sent money home to her mother, and told herself over and over that she was fine. But on that night alone, freezing and too proud to ask for help, she wasn't fine. She was unraveling. Half a block away, sitting inside a black SUV with heated leather seats and soft classical music humming through the speakers, Grayson Reed watched the snow fall in sheets. The city had already shut down. Most people had gone home. But something in him, maybe a restless ache or a familiar kind of loneliness, kept him driving through the quiet streets. That's when he saw her, not clearly at first, just a shadow on a bench, a shape too still, too small, too vulnerable to ignore. He didn't know her name, didn't know why she was out in the cold, but he saw the outline of exhaustion in her posture, the way her knees curled inward, the way her shoulders trembled under the weight of whatever she carried. He pulled over without thinking. When he stepped out of the car, the wind sliced across his coat, but he didn't flinch. His focus was on her. Every step felt urgent but calm. And when he finally reached her, crouched down so she wouldn't feel cornered, and said the words, "You're safe with me." "Let's go," she didn't resist. She couldn't, not because she was afraid, but because her body no longer had the energy to pretend. Without asking another question, Grayson lifted her into his arms. She was light, too light, and her head collapsed gently against his chest. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask where they were going. She just let herself be held. And that was the first miracle of the night. Inside his apartment, the air was warm, scented with eucalyptus and cedarwood. The fireplace crackled softly. Grayson placed her carefully on the couch, wrapped a blanket over her legs, and offered her a cup of ginger tea. No questions, no pressure, just presence. Elena blinked slowly as the color returned to her cheeks. Her fingers, still numb, curled around the cup. She hated the way her skin felt cold against his. Hated feeling like a burden. But Grayson didn't treat her like one. He spoke gently, moved with care, and listened more than he talked. She told him she had been tutoring in Dorchester, stayed too late, missed the bus. He nodded. He understood. She was trying to be everything for everyone. He had done that too. Later, when she finally asked, "Do you always help strangers like this?" he smiled and replied, "Only the ones freezing to death in party dresses." Her laugh was soft, half sob, half relief, and it filled the room with something that had been missing in both their lives: warmth without condition. They talked a little more about his mother, a nurse who raised him alone in Baltimore, about her father who left when she was 10. They weren't bonding. They were recognizing. Two people who knew what it meant to keep going long after the energy was gone. That night, Elena didn't fall in love. She didn't dream of fairy tales. But for the first time in years, she slept. Not because she was tired, but because she was finally safe. And Grayson. He didn't see himself as a rescuer, not a hero, just a man who remembered what it felt like to be cold and unseen, and who on one snowy night chose to reach for someone before they fell all the way down. The morning after the snowstorm, Elena Jameson awoke beneath layers of softness she didn't recognize, a throw blanket draped over her, the scent of cedarwood in the air, and the distant sound of someone stirring in the kitchen. For a brief moment, she forgot where she was. Her body ached in that deep, subtle way that comes not from injury, but from prolonged strain, the kind of wear that seeps into your bones when you've been pushing too hard for too long. Then it all came back. The snow, the missed bus, the numbness, the man, Grayson Reed. She sat up slowly on the couch, brushing a curl behind her ear as she glanced around. The apartment was understated but elegant. Floor-to-ceiling windows spilled morning light across polished floors, casting golden streaks over a muted gray couch and a stone fireplace. It was modern, yes, but it didn't feel cold. It felt lived in, safe, like the kind of place where silence didn't demand explanation. She stood carefully still, wrapped in the oversized t-shirt and sweatpants he'd lent her the night before. Her own clothes had been washed and folded, hanging neatly over a wooden chair near the window. That detail, small, quiet, intentional, hit her harder than she expected. She walked toward the kitchen. Grayson was at the stove wearing a simple white t-shirt and gray lounge pants. Nothing about him screamed CEO in that moment. If anything, he looked like someone who hadn't slept much, but still found calm in the rhythm of cooking. He turned before she could speak. "Morning," he said gently. "Morning," she replied, voice barely above a whisper. Um, I slept better than I have in weeks." "Good," he said with a soft nod. "Oatmeal and coffee. Nothing fancy." She slid into the stool by the counter. He passed her a cup just the way she liked it. She hadn't told him how she liked it. He just knew. They ate mostly in silence, interrupted only by the clink of spoons and the occasional glance. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful in the way only shared exhaustion can be. She told him about her students, especially one boy, Luis, who struggled with long division and believed he was too dumb for decimals. Grayson listened like it mattered, like she mattered. He told her about his mother who had raised him alone in Baltimore, about how she'd worked nights at a clinic and died too young, worn down by the weight of everyone else's pain. She used to stare into space over her morning coffee, he said. It wasn't sadness. It was just everything. All the noise she never had time to voice. Elena nodded, her throat tightening. I know that silence. By the time she stood to leave, the air between them had changed. Not romantic, not yet, but no longer unfamiliar. He offered to have his driver take her home. She said she'd catch the T. He insisted. And not because he didn't believe she could handle it, but because maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to handle everything alone anymore. She texted him that night, home safe. Thank you again. Really, he replied 5 minutes later. You don't owe me thanks. But I'm glad you're okay. Days passed, then weeks. They didn't fall into a routine, not exactly. But they began orbiting each other more deliberately. Coffee some mornings, late-night texts, the occasional bookstore meetup that turned into long conversations about nothing and everything. And for a while that was enough. But the deeper they drifted into connection, the more Elena found herself fighting an old enemy, the fear of being known. Grayson noticed the subtle shifts. How she'd laugh, then retreat. How she'd open up about her students but deflect when he asked about her family. How she never invited him into her world, only stepped cautiously into his. She too noticed things, like how he never talked about relationships, or how he was always composed, but sometimes too composed, like someone who had learned how to perform stillness when chaos brewed underneath. She once caught him staring at nothing in his office, hands motionless over a keyboard, the air around him heavy with ghosts. The distance between them wasn't made of silence. It was made of restraint. They were two people who had spent their lives surviving on independence, both secretly terrified that needing someone would mean weakness. Then came the crash. It happened on a Wednesday evening. Elena had been tutoring since noon her last student, a 10-year-old who cried when he couldn't grasp basic fractions. She stayed late, too late. Her phone battery died. She skipped lunch, then dinner. Her vision blurred mid-sentence. Her knees gave out. She collapsed. They called an ambulance, but someone in the tutoring center remembered the emergency contact listed in her file, Grayson Reed. He had insisted she add his number after a snowstorm weeks earlier. She didn't remember doing it, but she was glad she had. By the time he arrived, she was conscious, but barely upright. He didn't say much, just wrapped her coat around her shoulders and picked her up like he had that first night. You didn't answer my messages, he said quietly, back in his apartment, as he laid her on the couch. I'm fine, she whispered. No, you're not, he said. Passing out in a tutoring center isn't fine. That's burning out. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself. Her voice trembled. I told you I can handle it. He didn't yell, but his words landed with weight. This isn't about handling things. This is about killing yourself slowly in the name of being strong. Her silence was sharp. She finally looked at him. I didn't ask to be rescued, Grayson. I know. I don't need you to fix me. I'm not trying to fix you. Then what are you doing? His next words came slowly. Honestly, I care about you. That changed everything. Not because it was unexpected, but because it was real. And real things carried weight more than either of them were sure they could hold. She cried, just one tear silent and unwilling. Then she said, "I don't know how to accept that." He didn't move closer, didn't push, just knelt beside her, rested his hand near hers and whispered, "Then don't accept it. Just let it exist." That night she didn't sleep much, neither did he. They sat across from each other for hours, talking, pausing, unraveling truths too long buried. She told him about her father walking out, about how her mother worked double shifts at the pharmacy, about how she'd promised herself never to depend on anyone again. He told her about the pressure of being seen as a man who always had it together, about how people mistook his calm for strength when sometimes it was just numbness, about how he lost his mother before he ever got to tell her he was okay. In those hours, they weren't CEO and student. They weren't fixer and wounded. They were simply two people who had spent too many years pretending they didn't need softness. And for one, softness didn't feel like a threat. But healing isn't linear, and the fear didn't vanish overnight. Elena still hesitated when she received kind gestures. Grayson still overcompensated with control when things felt uncertain. Still, they kept choosing each other, through books shared over dinner, through messages that said, "I'm tired" instead of "I'm fine," through late-night drives to nowhere just to talk about the day. They didn't know what they were becoming, but for the first time in a long while, they weren't running. They were staying. Not because it was perfect, but because somehow they both believed it might be worth the risk. Weeks passed and winter slowly loosened its grip on Boston. The snowbanks melted into gray, slush-streaked corners, thawed into puddles, and sunlight returned in golden shards instead of cold glare. But inside Elena Jameson's chest, the chill hadn't left. Not completely, because something had changed, and she didn't know if it was for better or worse. Since the night she collapsed and Grayson carried her back, again something unspoken had wrapped itself between them. Not distance, not exactly. More like a tension made of unvoiced questions, of moments where she looked at him and wondered, "What are we becoming?" and saw him wondering the same. They still saw each other, still texted, still met at that little diner off Tremont Street, the one with sticky menus and the smell of cinnamon that clung to the walls. But now conversations felt measured, like they were walking a narrow bridge between comfort and confrontation, too afraid to fall in either direction. It wasn't that she didn't trust him. She did. But trust, Elena realized, wasn't the same as knowing where you stand. She had told him things she'd never said aloud before, about the pressure to be the strong one, about how she built her life on independence like armor. And he had listened deeply without trying to fix her. But that listening, kind and patient, had also made her wonder, what does he see in me? Was she a project, a redemption story he could quietly rewrite because he hadn't saved his mother in time? Or was she something more? That question festered. And Grayson, for all his gentle presence, had his own ghosts. He spoke in careful truths, never lies, but never the whole story either. He told her about his tech company, about the software tools that were now in over 200 underfunded schools across the U.S. But he never talked about how lonely that success had become, how the more people depended on his leadership, the less space he had to be uncertain or vulnerable or loved. One Friday evening, Elena found herself at the Learning Center again. A long week, too many students, too little sleep. She sat alone after her last session, scribbling lesson plans in the corner of a quiet room, her fingers aching from overuse and her mind buzzing with exhaustion. That's when her phone buzzed. "Grayson, dinner at our spot, 7. She stared at the message, thumb hovering. And for the first time in weeks, she didn't answer right away. Instead, she packed her things, grabbed her coat, and walked out into the cold this time, with no intention of being rescued. Back in Grayson's apartment, time ticked forward with a kind of cruel anticipation. He sat on the edge of his couch, a book open, but unread in his hands. The clock read 7:42. Still no reply. He wasn't angry. He was worried. Because he knew that Elena didn't just ghost people. If she was quiet, it meant something was brewing, and he didn't know whether to chase her or wait. He waited. At 9:11 p.m., his phone buzzed. "Elena, I need to talk to you. Tomorrow. In person. No emojis. No softened edges." He replied simply, "Anytime." They met the next morning at the bench. That bench. The one where months ago she had nearly frozen to death in a dress too thin for January. She chose the place on purpose, not out of nostalgia, but clarity, because whatever she needed to say, she wanted to remember the beginning. She arrived first. Grayson came 5 minutes later in a long navy coat scarf loose at his neck. His eyes softened when he saw her, but he didn't smile. Not yet. Elena, he said. She didn't return the greeting. Just nodded and gestured to the bench. They sat. Wind swept past them like memory soft, lingering, undeniable. I've been trying to find the words, she began, hands folded tightly in her lap. And the truth is, I'm scared. Of what, he asked gently. Of not knowing what this is, she said. Of not knowing what I am to you. He exhaled slow. Elena. No, she cut in, not unkindly. Let me finish. He nodded. I need to say this without interruption. Because if I don't, I'll lose the nerve again. He turned toward her, fully eyes steady. I care about you, she said. Probably more than I want to admit. But I've spent most of my life convincing myself that needing someone equals weakness. That accepting love makes me vulnerable. And for the first time I met someone who made me question that belief. But I need to know what this is. Because I can't keep walking beside you if I'm the only one wondering whether we're headed in the same direction. Grayson didn't respond immediately. His jaw tightened. His throat moved like he swallowed a weight that hadn't yet settled. Then he spoke. You're not the only one wondering. She blinked. I've been holding back, he continued. Not because I don't feel something, because I do. Stronger than I've ever let myself feel in a long time. But because I'm terrified that if I speak it aloud, it will make it real. And if it's real, it can be lost. Just like... He trailed off. She didn't press. My mother died before I could tell her I was okay, he whispered. Before I could tell her I made it. That her sacrifices mattered. That I wasn't angry anymore. His eyes were wet. Not broken. Just exposed. And you, Elena, you make me feel things I thought I had buried. You make me want to share things, open doors I boarded up a long time ago. That scares me. Because if I lose you, I'm not sure I know how to recover from that. Elena's heart pounded. But I'd rather risk it, he added, than sit beside you in silence and pretend I don't care. He reached into his coat pocket, not with a ring or a grand gesture, but with a note. Folded, weathered. Her handwriting. She recognized it instantly. It was the note she had once left in a borrowed book on his shelf. You make the world quieter. That's why I like being near you. He handed it to her. I kept this, he said, not because it was sweet, but because it reminded me of who I am when I'm with you. And I like that version of me. She held the paper like it was something sacred. Then she looked up. Do you love me? She asked, voice steady. He didn't flinch. Yes. She inhaled sharply, eyes stinging. I think I've loved you for a while now, she confessed. But I was too scared to ask if I mattered. Too scared to hear silence. He leaned closer, not to kiss her, not yet, but to be present. No more silence, he said, and for the first time they didn't sit as strangers healing separately. They sat as something new, not defined, not perfect, but shared. They didn't make promises that day. They didn't map out futures or post pictures or tell anyone. They just stood when the wind picked up, walked hand in hand back toward the city, and agreed on one thing. If they were going to figure this out, they would do it the way they began, not as a rescue, but as two people choosing to stay in the conversation even when it got hard to speak. Spring in Boston had always arrived like a slow confession, one that took its time, but eventually unfolded in full color. Flowers bloomed hesitantly along the edges of cobblestone streets, and park benches filled once more with readers, runners, and teenagers with earbuds and laughter. Elena Jameson stood in the center of it, alarms crossed shoulders, tight heart loud beneath a neutral expression. She wasn't nervous. She was aware, acutely aware of eyes that lingered too long, of conversations that paused when she entered a room of classmates who smiled a little too tightly after seeing her step out of a car that didn't match her income bracket. Grayson Reed's car. In the 3 weeks since they had finally said the words out loud, I love you, Elena and Grayson had tried to return to normal life. Except what they had wasn't normal. Not to the world around them. Not to her classmates. Not to his business partners. And definitely not to the journalists who began piecing things together. It started with a blurry photo. Grayson and Elena sitting at their usual diner laughing over coffee. Harmless. But then someone posted it online with a caption, "Is this the mystery woman seen with EdTech mogul Grayson Reed for the past month?" The post didn't go viral, but it didn't have to. The people who needed to see, it did. Board members, investors, her professors, his communications team, her classmates. It was Tasha, sharp-tongued and always well-meaning, who approached Elena first. So she said with an amused tilt of her head, "You and Grayson Reed. Not bad, Elena. From bus stops to Bentleys. That's a hell of a come-up." Elena stiffened. "It's not like that." Sure, Tasha smirked. "But don't forget who people think you are when you walk into a room, or who they assume he is when they see you with him." She didn't respond. She just walked away. But the words lingered. That night she told Grayson, "I'm not embarrassed," she said, "but I am being watched in a way that feels dangerous. Like anything I do will be twisted into proof that I'm not worthy of you." Grayson listened, but something in his jaw tightened. "You are worthy," he said firmly. "That's not even a question." "It's not my question," she replied. "It's theirs." He reached across the table, took her hand, then let them ask. Let them talk. What we have doesn't need their permission. She wanted to believe him, but she also knew how people worked, especially in circles where image was currency. The next blow came in a faculty meeting Elena wasn't even present for. Her advisor, Professor Halbrook, pulled her aside the following morning. "Just a heads up," he said gently, "some of the administration are aware of your association with Mr. Reed." She didn't flinch. "And in theirs concern it might influence your standing in the fellowship process. Fair or not?" Her stomach dropped. She had earned every inch of her place in the competitive Larkson Fellowship program. Long nights, volunteer hours, GPA, field work, and now, what it might be jeopardized because she shared a few meals and a quiet truth with a man who listened when no one else did. She nodded. "Thanks for telling me." That evening, she didn't go to Grayson's apartment. She went home. She turned off her phone. And for the first time in months, she cried not because she was hurt, but because she was exhausted by the invisible games respectability required her to play. Grayson noticed her silence. He gave her a day, then another. But by the third day, he knocked on her door. When she opened it, her eyes were puffy, her hair pulled back in a haphazard bun, and her voice flat. "Hi." He didn't smile. "Can I come in?" She nodded, stepping aside. They sat on her couch. No tea, no soft music, just air full of weight. "What happened?" he asked. She told him everything. The photo, the whispers, the fellowship. His hands balled into fists, not out of anger at her, but at the way the world refused to let things be simple. "I should protected you," he said. She shook her head. "This isn't your fault." "Maybe not," he admitted. "But I hate that loving me makes your life harder." She looked at him, then really looked. "Loving you doesn't make my life harder, Grayson. Other people's reaction to it does. And I'm not going to punish you for their fear." He breathed out slow. "Then what do we do?" Elna walked to the window. The city moved below, unaware of the quiet storm inside her apartment. "I think we stop hiding," she said. "Not shout it from rooftops, but stop apologizing. Stop shrinking." He stood beside her, the city reflected in both their silhouettes. "So we're choosing this." She turned to him. "I already did." From that moment on, things changed, not overnight, but deliberately. Elena didn't flinch when classmates whispered. She held her head higher in class. She responded to comments with grace, but with steel beneath her words. Grayson made no public statements, but at the next board meeting, when someone casually suggested he rethink certain associations for the sake of optics, he responded with a single sentence. "If my personal life threatens your confidence, the issue is my life, it's your comfort." It was the most corporate way to say I'm not letting go of her. Ever. Weeks later, Elena was officially announced as a Larkson Fellow. The recognition came not because of who she dated, but because of what she did, her work, her heart, her quiet leadership. At the award ceremony, Grayson sat in the back, unassuming, proud. He didn't wear a designer suit. He didn't make a speech. He just stood when she walked off the stage and met her outside in the spring air. You're glowing, he said, smiling. She shook her head. I'm just finally breathing again. They didn't kiss in public. That wasn't them. But she leaned her forehead against his and he whispered, let them talk. You already wrote your answer. The next week, a journalist reached out for an interview, asked Elena if she'd speak about the quiet romance between two very different worlds. She declined, because what they had wasn't quiet. It was just theirs. It started with a single question. They were sitting on the floor of Grayson's apartment a Sunday afternoon, stretched wide between half-finished coffee and the soft hum of Miles Davis on vinyl. Elena was grading papers. Grayson was reviewing slide decks for an upcoming investor call. At some point, the conversation shifted. I've been thinking, Elena said without lifting her head. Grayson glanced over from his laptop pen, paused between his fingers. Dangerous way to start a sentence. She smirked, then set the red pen down. What if we could build something together, not just a relationship, something that helps people like my students, like Luis, like Nina, like Meetin years ago? Grayson sat up straighter. She continued, her voice more certain. Now we talk all the time about how access is changing the way schools manage data, build curriculum, track outcomes. But what about the things it can't measure? Like hunger, exhaustion, hope. Or the fact that half my students don't have internet at home? He studied her. Keep going. She exhaled, slowly gathering her thoughts. What if we created a hub, a physical place? Maybe just one at first, where kids can come after school, free tutoring, mental health support, even meals. But it's powered by access tech. Tracked, supported, smart. We can use everything you've built and everything I've seen. Grayson's face didn't change much, but his eyes lit like someone had just flipped a switch. Elena, he said after a long pause, you realize this isn't just an idea. This is infrastructure. This is legacy. She smiled, nervous but steady. Maybe I'm finally ready to build something that lasts. He leaned over, kissed her hand and whispered, then let's start laying the foundation. They called it the Keystone Project, a name Elena chose because she had once taught her students about Roman arches. The keystone is the one that holds everything together, she explained. The pressure actually makes it stronger. Within 2 weeks, Grayson had assembled a discreet but formidable team, legal counsel, operations directors, grant writers. Elena, meanwhile, met with school administrators across the city, pulled after-hours conversations with teachers, parents, and even janitors. We don't need another polished brochure, she told them. We need to know what's really missing. One principal at a Roxbury middle school said it plainly. The kids are brilliant, but their lives are loud. They don't need more pressure. They need quiet space to try and fail without punishment. That sentence stuck with Elena. She wrote it on a Post-it and taped it to Grayson's fridge. They need quiet space to try. Funding wasn't an issue, Grayson made sure of that, but trust that had to be earned. So they didn't launch with a press release or a flashy campaign. They started with a soft rollout, just one pilot center on the 3rd floor of a public library above the reading rooms and across from the genealogy archives. It was humble, clean, painted with calming colors, stocked with tablets, beanbag chairs, math games, and donated books. A rotating schedule of volunteers, mostly graduate students and retired teachers, staffed the space from 3 p.m. to 7 p.m., Monday through Friday. Elena was there every day. She didn't wear a name tag. She didn't act like a founder. She sat on the floor with 5th graders, helped teens craft college essays, taught one girl how to breathe through panic before a geometry test. Grayson watched her from the sidelines sometimes, never interfering, always present. One evening, he brought her dinner because she'd forgotten to eat. Again. You realize you're the engine here, he told her. I'm just the starter cable, she said. The engine's already running. These kids just needed someone to believe they were worth tuning. Word spread, quietly but steadily. A mother of 3 called Elena the week after her son passed his first math quiz in months. He smiled, she said on the voicemail, voice cracking. He actually smiled after school. You don't know what that means in our house. A local newspaper wrote a feature titled, 2 Hearts, 1 Mission, The Unlikely Pair, Changing After-School Education in Boston. Elena hated the headline. Grayson just laughed. Could have been worse. They didn't call us Beauty and the Billionaire. But what neither of them expected was what came next, an email. From Washington, D.C., it was from the Department of Education. A woman named Carolyn Reedno, relation to Grayson, wanted to schedule a meeting. She had read the article, visited the Keystone Pilot site under a pseudonym, and left deeply moved. "I think this could be a model," she wrote. "We're reviewing grants for regional learning hubs. Your center is one of the most community-rooted I've seen." Elena stared at the screen for a long time, then forwarded the email to Grayson with one line, "Ready to scale." The months that followed were a blur of permits, hiring, interviews, policy calls, and hard choices. They expanded to 2 new locations, one in South Chicago, the other in East Oakland. Elena insisted on site visits before anything was approved. "I want to meet the people before we meet the numbers," she said. Grayson gave her full rein, but with growth came pressure, and with pressure came strain. They were still in love eyes, but now they were also co-leaders, co-builders, co-decision makers. They argued over curriculum structures, volunteer vetting, social worker roles, and whether Keystone should accept corporate sponsorships. One night after a particularly long meeting, Elena stormed out of the office and down the hall. Grayson followed. "Elena," he called gently. She turned. "I'm not doing this to be famous. I'm not doing this to be your PR redemption story. I'm doing this because I remember being a 12-year-old girl trying to read by streetlight. And I will not let this become just another polished nonprofit that forgets why it exists." He didn't respond right away, just nodded slowly. "You're right." The silence between them wasn't cold. It was respect recalibrating. That night, they fell asleep on opposite ends of the couch, laptops on their laps, a stack of grant applications between them. A year after the first Keystone Center opened, they held a celebration, not for the press, not for donors, but for the families. It was simple folding chairs, catered food, and a cork board where kids pinned handwritten notes. One note read, "This place helped me not give up." Another, "Miss Elena made me feel like I mattered." Grayson read each one in silence, then turned to Elena, who was wiping punch off a kid's shirt. "Come here," he said, reaching for her hand. He led her outside into the spring air, under a sky full of stars and streetlight. "This," he said softly, "this is what I want to build with you. Not just programs, not just purpose. A life that feels like this." She smiled. "We're doing it." He pulled something from his coat pocket, a small silver key. "I know you have your own place and your own rules, but this is the key to mine. Not because I need you to move in, but because I never want you to knock again." She took the key, held it like it meant something, because it did. They didn't rush marriage. They didn't post everything online. They weren't a brand. They were builders. But those who knew them, really knew them, could tell the love they had built was more than romance. It was structure, it was foundation, it was a keystone, and it was holding. Elena Jameson never wanted to be anyone's headline. She didn't dream of billboards, didn't need applause. Her joy had always lived in quiet places, behind a math worksheet suddenly understood, in the eyes of a parent exhaling for the first time in weeks, or in the silence after a hard truth had finally been spoken aloud. But when you fall in love with a man like Grayson Reed, founder of one of the fastest-growing edtech firms in the country, privacy becomes a flickering line. And when the mission you build together starts changing lives in ways people can see, the world inevitably comes knocking. At first, it was subtle. A journalist reached out for a profile, not on Grayson, but on her. "We've heard whispers," the message read, "about your impact, your presence, your story. We'd love to spotlight you for our Leaders in Equity series." Elena declined, not because she wasn't proud, but because she wasn't ready to be parsed into sound bites and hashtags. What she and Grayson had created with the Keystone Project didn't need a spotlight. It needed sustaining. But then came the keynote invitation from the National Forum on Public Education, held annually in D.C., where educators, lawmakers, and industry leaders gathered to discuss the future of learning. The request came addressed to both of them. "We'd be honored," the email said, "if you and Mr. Reed would co-deliver this year's closing keynote, Innovation with Integrity, a model for community-rooted reform." Grayson was thrilled. Elena was cautious. "This changes things," she said one night, curled beside him on the couch, her head resting on his shoulder. "It elevates things," he replied, brushing her hand gently. "But we'll do it our way, not theirs." She wanted to believe him. The preparations were intense. Planning sessions, coordination with government liaisons, speech revisions, slide decks. But what neither of them anticipated was what happened before the keynote: a leak. An anonymous blog popular among education activists published an expose titled "Access to Whom When Billionaire Influence Wears a Progressive Mask." It accused Grayson Reed of using Elena's background story and community access to sanitize a corporate expansion effort disguised as charity. It questioned Keystone's transparency funding sources and even the authenticity of Elena's leadership. There were screenshots, harmless taken out of context. Elena at a conference dinner, Grayson speaking to state leaders, even a photo of the two of them walking hand in hand framed beneath a cruel caption, "Romance meets rebranding." Elena read the article in silence. When she finished, she turned to Grayson and said, "Don't defend me. Let me speak." The keynote hall was filled with over 3,000 attendees. The room buzzed with anticipation. Educators, journalists, critics, parents. The seats in the front row were reserved for White House policy advisors. Grayson stepped up first. He spoke clearly, concisely, confidently. He outlined the data, the growth, the model, the results. He acknowledged criticism without defensiveness and reiterated one thing: Keystone was built to close the gap between intention and impact. Then he stepped aside. Elena approached the podium. Her presence alone shifted the energy in the room. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "My name is Elena Jameson," she began, "and I did not fall in love with the CEO. I fell in love with a man who listened, who saw my students the way I didn't, as numbers or case files, but as futures still being shaped." She paused. "What we built wasn't for the press. It was for the kid in Roxbury who can't focus on fractions because his stomach's empty. For the girl in Oakland who hasn't said a full sentence in 2 weeks because she doesn't feel safe at home." Another pause. "And yes, I care deeply about the man beside me, but I did not need him to become the woman standing here today. I needed space. I needed belief. I needed room to fail and still be trusted." Applause started softly, then grew. Elena continued, "So if anyone's still asking whether I'm a puppet or a pawn or a pretty face for progress, ask the kid who passed his GED last week after 6 tries. Ask the mom who now volunteers at our site because for once her voice was invited in." She stepped back, and the room rose. Not in frenzy, but in recognition. In the days that followed, the narrative shifted. Not because they fought the smear campaign, but because they told the truth, authentically, without performance, and people felt it. Elena received letters, hundreds, from teachers, principals, counselors, from students. One note written in shaky pencil said, "You make me believe I can be smart and black and still safe." Grayson framed it in his office. But even after the public standing ovation, private questions remained. One night back in Boston, they sat on Grayson's rooftop, the skyline glittering behind them. A gentle spring breeze swept through, carrying the smell of lilacs from the street below. "I don't want to become a brand," Elena whispered. Grayson looked at her. "I know. I don't want to forget what quiet felt like, or lose the things that made this real in the first place." He nodded. "Then let's set the rules ourselves," he said. So they did. They agreed to no press about their relationship, no sponsored posts, no reality documentaries, no letting others package their story for consumption. Instead, they focused on Keystone, on building local advisory councils composed of students, parents, and community leaders to guide program direction, on creating an ethics charter co-authored by Elena and a panel of grassroots educators that became required reading for all Keystone staff, on launching the Listening Library, a digital platform where anonymous stories from underserved students could be archived, honored, and used to inform future interventions. They didn't monetize these efforts. They didn't announce them with banners. They just did them. 1 year later, Elena stood in the quiet of a new center, this one in Tulsa. The lights were off. The space wasn't open yet, but she liked to arrive early to sit alone with the space before the voices filled it. Grayson joined her, coffee in hand. No suit, no entourage. "Still quiet enough for you?" he asked. She smiled. "Just right." He pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "What's that, your old fellowship essay?" he said. "I found it in my archives. Wanted to reread the part you wrote about legacy." She reached for it, but he held it back. Let me read it to you. He unfolded it, and in the hush of that unlit room, he read her own words aloud. Legacy isn't what you leave behind when you're gone. It's what you build in others while you're still here. And it starts in quiet rooms with unglamorous work and the courage to stay when things get uncomfortable. When he finished, he looked up. Elena blinked slowly, then said, I still believe every word. So do I, he whispered. They stood there in the center of something they had made not perfect, not flawless, but honest. And when the lights flicked on minutes later and the sound of children's laughter echoed from the hallway, it felt less like the end of a chapter and more like the turning of a page. Because sometimes the most enduring love stories aren't the ones broadcasted to millions. They're the ones lived quietly, consistently, and with purpose, far from the spotlight, but forever etched in the foundation of what comes next. The first thing Elena Jameson noticed about the island was the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the kind of hush that feels sacred, like the world has taken a breath and is waiting for you to do the same. It had been 3 years since she and Grayson Reed opened the first Keystone Center above a dusty library in Roxbury. Since then, they had built 12 more across 8 states. They had been invited to the White House, spoken before the Senate Committee on Education, and been named 2 of Time's most influential people in public service. But none of that had prepared Elena for the moment she finally stepped off the small ferry onto the coast of Thistle Island, a quiet strip of land off the coast of Maine. No reporters, no cameras, no applause. Just wind, ocean, and Grayson's hand in hers. They had bought the land a year prior, not for show, not even for retreat, for rest. Grayson had found it first, an old cabin once owned by a retired teacher and his wife. It was modest, aged, and wrapped in pine trees. But when he brought Elena there the first time, she looked at the worn floors and the sunlit windows and simply said, this feels like exhaling. So now finally they returned, not as escapees, but as architects of stillness. They spent the first few days doing nothing and everything. Elena picked wild blueberries with her sleeves rolled to the elbow. Grayson repaired the porch steps with a stubborn kind of pride. They cooked together, fought over the correct amount of cinnamon and oatmeal, and argued lovingly about what made a good Sunday. No emails, no boards, no press kits, just quiet. One night after a thunderstorm, they sat on the back steps wrapped in a wool blanket, listening to the earth drip dry. I've been thinking, Elena set her head on his shoulder. Grayson chuckled. That phrase always ends in a new initiative. She nudged him gently. Not this time. He waited. I've spent a long time wondering what my story would be. What would last? What would outlive me? She paused. And now I think, maybe it's not the programs, or the speeches, or even the centers. He turned to her. Then what? She looked at him. It's the way we stayed. He didn't speak right away, just kissed the top of her head. They weren't married, not because they didn't believe in it, but because they didn't need the word to define the bond. They had ring-simple bands, no diamond, no ceremony, but more as a reminder we chose this, daily, quietly. They had separate apartments still in different parts of Boston, but by now they used the same coffee mugs, read the same books, wore each other's sweaters, and fell asleep more often than not in the same bed. Their love wasn't built on declarations. It was built on consistency. But time, even when honored, is not always gentle. One fall, just after Keystone's 5th anniversary, Grayson's mother's sister, Aunt Carol, passed away. She had been the last living member of the Reed family. Grayson didn't cry at the funeral, but that night back at the cabin, he stood on the dock and whispered, "There's no one left who remembers me as a child." Elena wrapped her arms around his waist. Then we start remembering together. And they did. Grayson began writing letters, not emails, handwritten ones, to students, to teachers, to Elena. Letters about grief, about building, about failure. He published them online as notes from the quiet. They went viral, but he never responded to comments, never monetized them. They weren't written for the world, they were written through it. When Elena turned 35, she didn't want a party. She wanted to walk through the oldest trail on Thistle Island, where the trees arched overhead like cathedrals and the moss muffled every step. At the trail's end, they came upon a clearing Grayson had been quietly working on for weeks. A wooden bench, a tree planted behind it, a plaque that read, "For the woman who taught me that silence can speak and love doesn't have to shout to be heard." She didn't cry. She just sat down beside him and whispered, "I'll remember this when I'm old." He smiled. "I'll remind you anyway." They never had children of their own. Not because they didn't want to, but because life and timing and choices had unfolded in other directions. But they were never without family. Their lives were surrounded by the kids they mentored, the staff they trained, the communities they served. Every birthday card from a former student, every email that started with, "You probably don't remember me," but was a seed in the garden they had cultivated. One student, Luis, whom Elena had once helped pass remedial algebra, later became a Keystone site director in Baltimore. At a conference, he introduced her with tears in his eyes and said, "She didn't just teach me math. She taught me that not giving up on someone is a form of love." Afterward, Elena wept, not because of the compliment, but because it was true, and because it mattered. In their 10th year together, Grayson fell ill. Nothing dramatic, no movie moment, just a slow fatigue and ache that didn't go away. A diagnosis whispered more gently than it needed to be: chronic heart failure. Manageable, treatable, but real. He was 48. Elena sat beside him at the doctor's office, her hand gripping his, so tightly her knuckles paled. When they got home, he made tea. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked. He shrugged. "Now I'd rather talk about what we're going to do with it." She stared. "Grayson, this is your heart." He smiled faintly. "It's ours now." And just like that, they began a new chapter. Slower, more intentional. He traveled less. She did more speaking. They spent more time at the cabin, learned to cook better, laughed harder, and one morning while sitting by the window watching fog roll across the sea, Grayson turned to Elena and said, "I think it's time." For what he reached for a small book on the shelf. The plan, he said, "For when I'm not here." She swallowed hard. "Don't. I need to. Not for me. For you. For Keystone. For what we've built." They spent that entire week crafting a legacy document: who would carry the torch, how funding would be protected, how no one could ever use Keystone for political leverage or personal gain. It was the most loving thing he ever did for her. 2 years later, he passed quietly at the cabin on a spring morning with a book on his chest and the sea outside still humming like a lullaby. Elena didn't fall apart because she had been held, because he had stayed, because everything he left behind was not just infrastructure, but intention. Today, Elena still runs Keystone, not as a grieving partner, but as a keeper of the fire. She wears a simple silver necklace shaped like a keystone arch engraved inside with the words, "We stayed." And sometimes when she visits the cabin alone, she walks the trail, sits on the bench beneath that tree, and speaks into the wind. "I remember. I'm still here, and the work is still good." Because real love doesn't always need grand gestures or grand finales. Sometimes it simply asks, "Will you still choose me tomorrow when no one's watching?" And the answer for them was always yes. In a world that often confuses noise with significance, the story of Elena and Grayson reminds us that some of life's most powerful acts are quiet. Love doesn't have to be loud to be real. Legacy doesn't require a spotlight, requires consistency, care, and the courage to stay when things get hard. As we grow older, we begin to understand that it's not the grand gestures that define us, but the daily choices to show up with intention, with empathy, and with honesty. This story is a testament to what can happen when two people decide not to fix each other, but to build together. It teaches us that even after years of independence, it's never too late to open your heart to rest in trust and to plant something that will outlive applause. Whether you're in your 60s, 70s, or beyond, remember it's not about being seen by the world. It's about being truly known by someone and choosing day after day to walk beside them in faith, not fear. Because sometimes the most extraordinary life is built not with noise, but with presence. And that's a truth that never ages. Elena Jameson gave her heart to the classroom, to her students, and ultimately to a vision bigger than herself. She didn't ask for fame, recognition, or sympathy, only the chance to serve, to lead with quiet strength, and to build something that could outlast her. Through grief, criticism, and the weight of leadership, she stayed. But now the road ahead is hers to define. What should Elena do next? Should she continue expanding? Keystone, should she return to the classroom she first loved? Or is it time for her to write her own story, one that finally puts her voice first? Let us know what you think. What would you do in her shoes? What does legacy mean to you? Support Elena by leaving a kind word, a reflection, or even just one simple comment that says you stayed, and that mattered. If you love this story and believe in the power of quiet resilience, comment the number 1 below. Let's show Elena she's not walking this road alone.